Today I want to talk with you about trans fats. You've probably heard that you should be avoiding trans fats and that they are bad for heart health. But should you be avoiding ruminant trans fats? These are, in contrast to industrial trans fats, which are made in a lab from vegetable oils, these ruminant trans fats are made by bacteria in the gut of ruminants, so cows. They make their way into your dairy and into meat from cows and sheep. Should you be avoiding those? I'll tell you first what the health authorities say. They don't really come out and say something explicit, but they do treat ruminant trans fats the same way they treat industrial trans fats in terms of food regulations and recommendations. So globally, most organizations recommend about no more than 1% of calories from trans fats, which translates for adults to about 2 grams a day of trans fats. That's what's considered to be probably safe. Those same health authorities will tell you that they don't know whether going lower is actually going to give you even more cardiovascular benefits than keeping it under 2 grams. So on the one hand, health regulators seem to be lumping them together. On the other hand, there are a number of observational studies, so just simple populations, just looking at dairy intake compared to heart health. And we don't always see a link between cardiovascular outcomes and dairy intake. So some people interpret this as, dairy is safe, the trans fats in dairy are safe. I have a different conclusion. My conclusion, and I think many of the health authorities agree, is that we haven't really tested dairy at dairy trans fats and meat trans fats in very high doses. So it's hard to be conclusive and say that they're safe just based on these observational studies. These studies have a lot of caveats, but one of the biggest caveats is they are only looking at relatively low doses. When we were using industrial trans fats, regularly, we were getting into the 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 grams a day doses, whereas most average dairy consumers are consuming about 1 gram a day of dairy-based trans fats. So I think the message that the dose makes the poison probably explains how, on the one hand, ruminant trans fats and industrial trans fats are actually very similar molecules, but on the other hand, we haven't seen poor heart health in people who consume dairy in every study. There are some studies that do show advantages to lack of dairy. For example, some of the Seventh-day Adventist studies comparing vegetarians to vegans and showing better cardiovascular health. But again, any of these observational studies we must take with a grain of salt. Before I wrap up, I just wanted to give you some of my thoughts on sort of first principles. Guilty until proven innocent, or innocent until proven guilty. Let's just look at, sort of physically, how do industrial trans fats differ from ruminant trans fats? And the answer is not a lot. So both of them are 18 carbon units long, and they are both mostly saturated, but they have a single unsaturated site, or a single double bond. Now where they differ is in the position of the double bond. So that's, that difference may or may not be meaningful, but it seems reasonable to assume there's a good chance that they have the same effects. We also know that in isolation, trans fats from dairy and meat do actually increase LDL levels. Now, in terms of the bottom line, we also really need to incorporate the fact that when we're eating industrial trans fats, we're usually eating them in very high amounts and in the context of unhealthy foods and in highly processed foods and fried foods and so on. When we're eating ruminant trans fats, in some cases that food may have some good things going for it, like in the case of a whole milk. Again, I don't want to get into a big discussion of health merits of dairy, but suffice it to say, a glass of milk is probably better for you than, French fries. So when you're looking at whether or not, your personal choices around trans fats, I would just encourage you to, put it in the cons column, but when you're looking at a food choice, you need to look at the pros of that food as well. So if it's an ice cream or a cheeseburger or, a massive scone that's very buttery, that's got a lot more cons than it has pros, whereas again, it's a little bit of a different math if you're looking at whole milk or plain yogurt. Lastly, I would just say, what are some of the top sources of ruminant trans fats? Again, keep in mind the recommendation is under 2 grams a day total of trans fats. A single hamburger is going to get you about 1 gram of trans fats if it's a high fat cut. And most dairy products are about 0.25 grams of trans fats per serving, so per small serving. But bear in mind that under 0.5 grams is going to be rounded down to 0 on the label. So just be watchful and make your own decision, just bearing this in mind.